Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Robert, and it's a real treat to be here today with Bill Chmura and Jeff Westendorf, two people who have had great success with budgets. Well, we prepare these webinars based on feedback from our clients and webinar attendees, and a large number of you have indicated that budgets are stressful and that you'd like some help dealing with the issues. We know many of you are facing these issues, owners who think the fees, the assessments are too high, or point out that their assessments are higher than neighboring properties. So we hear you're getting pushback and resistance from the very start. And as a reserve study provider, we regularly hear concern about affording adequate reserve contributions. So we know there's financial pressure. So we're here today to address these issues. I hope you're ready to take some notes because we have some great material, but like all our webinars, we're recording this session. So it will be available on YouTube and our websites for future payback within about a week. Another resource is an outline of today's program that we're going to send to everyone who fills out a brief survey at the end of today's session. So please fill out that survey and make sure you add some comments about what you'd like to hear in future webinars, and you'll get a copy of all the slides. Before I jump into today's material, let me remind you that this is a live presentation and everyone's been muted to keep the background noise to a minimum. But all of us are used to speaking to a live audience, so to get your feedback every once in a while, we may ask you to raise your hand by clicking on the hands raised icon that you see in the control panel. It looks like the one that you see on screen. And if you came with a question, or if any time you have a question that arose due to something we've said, just type it in the dialog box that's just below that hands raised icon. Paige is going to be monitoring that through our session today, and we'll select from those at the end during our Q&A time. So, without delay, grab your mouse and give me a hands raised if you're ready for us to start the program. Fantastic. Okay, thanks for being with us. I'm going to click everyone's hands down and on to the next slide. So let me set the table for our guest speakers with some perspective. In the big picture, remember that your homes are valued at thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what we're talking today about are the tens or hundreds of dollars per year difference in the budget. The homeowner assessments are literally the details that can make a pivotal difference in the life and value of your home in the association. And we're here today because boards have a responsibility to protect, maintain, and enhance the assets of the association on behalf of the owners. Board members can be sued for not doing the job well, so it's a responsibility to take seriously. Jeff, Bill, and I are all believers that the future is in your control. You can create a great future for your association. And again, we believe it's in the tens or hundreds of dollars a year, those adjustments that you make to your existing budgets that are going to make all the difference to your owners. You get to decide. And finally, we all want your association to thrive. A great future is out there waiting for you. If we had a magic wand, we'd share this information with all boards across the country to make a marked improvement in the community home ownership experience. So here we are. Bill's going to get us started with the big picture, telling us how the game is won. And Jeff is going to bring us home with a skill set to play this game well, stacking the odds in your favor of a great outcome. So without further delay, let me turn the microphone over to Bill.
Thank you, Robert. As you've heard, I've been treasurer of our condo for 13 years. We're in a complex that actually started in 1970. We have about 645 units. We have 9 different sister associations. So not only have I developed budgets and systems, but I've seen problems created when directors ignore some overriding principles. And I'd like to share some of these principles with you today. The first one, number one, is the source of income. Our owners are the only source of income, and they pay now or later, but they pay. That's the issue. There's no avoiding this issue. Proponents of keeping fees below the actual cost level fail to recognize this important fact. Keeping fees below the cost levels to run an association only results in deferred payments, requires other sources like loans or special assessments. but the owners still pay. And if you try to keep the fees low to save money, they usually pay more. Nowhere in our declaration, I don't know if anybody else's, is it in the association's responsibility to balance the budget of owners. That's their job. Your job is to pass the cost of maintenance on to owners. As an example, recently one of our sister associations artificially set fees low, 1 year because the owners cannot afford higher costs or higher fees. On top of this, they overspent the budget. In the end, they had to issue a $30,000 special assessment, had to withdraw $48,000 out of the reserve fund. And the next year, the fees went up over 15% to cover the actual costs and to cover the payback to replenish the reserves. So while the instinct is to prevent the owner's fees was noble, in turn, the owner still had to pay. This principle is no more vivid than in reserves for the long-term projects. The choice is to pay little at a time now or pay more in bulk later. We should not be insensitive to an owner's ability to pay, and we're not. And there are things that an association can do to keep the fees low. This leads to the second principle. Second principle is the only way to lower fees is to lower costs. We're responsible to maintain facilities, both the short and the long term, and we're responsible to pass these costs on to owners. There's two types of fees. There's the long-term fees and the short-term fees, the operation and the reserves. I personally can't understand why an association ignores long-term costs in the reserve planning. I wish more states would require it as a necessity. For the actual budget, the operating budget, I'm not a proponent of avoiding maintenance responsibilities or afraid to spend when necessary. I am a proponent, however, of getting the most value for the money and spend on necessities. This takes works, planning, and diligence. Make sure you budget just for the necessities. Get multiple quotes, use contracts and detailed work statements to make sure you get what you want. Organize volunteer efforts for light jobs. Spending should not be an emotional issue based on facts. As an example, another one, some of our owners recently were pushing to redo our roofs because of too many leaks. And when we looked into the history of repairs, we found out we're spending $3,000 a year on leak-related repairs when new roofs would cost the association $300,000. The motions say yes, the facts say wait. A big understanding about reserves is that they are tomorrow's costs, and they are not. The cost is today's cost of deterioration, even though the payment for the projects happen in the future. The costs are when incurred, not when paid. I really don't like the word reserves because it couldn't be interpreted as a contingency to some or money available just in case to others. However, it's a plan based on well-defined future projects. There is substance behind the plan. There's a lot of different advantages to reserve plan. Let me point out a few of them. First of all, I think it's the clearest description of what your future maintenance responsibilities are. It's the lowest cost overall to all the owners, and it's the fairest way to pay for long-term maintenance. Let me talk about each of those individually. Having a formal plan developed lays the foundation for long-term maintenance. The components list define what you're planning to do and when you're planning to do it. Once done, you can track it in ensuing years. It's not only a financial tool, it's a great communications document for your owners. It makes a clearly described plan. During each year's review, it can be modified to current conditions. The lowest cost part of the plan to owners is realized when you earn interest on the money that's sitting in your fund, in order to lower the eventual price to the owners. Knowing the reserve cash flow allows you to invest optimally. If you have to borrow to pay projects, you pay higher interest rates and thus incur higher costs of the plan. And guess what? These are cash flow loans, so the added debt service means that the owners still pay. They're not avoiding it. And then it's the fairest way to do this over the long-term costs. Owners only pay during the time they live in these in the condos. New owners are not charged for deterioration that happened before they were owners. One of our sister associations recently assessed $8,000 for new roofs to each one of the owners. Owners were there for only a few years, paid the same as those who were there for the last 20 years. That's just not fair. I look at it as a form of musical chairs. Whoever's sitting there when the music stops loses. In my experience, the only owners who object to reserves are those who are trying to avoid their obligation to pay their fair share of maintenance costs, or those who don't trust that the association will follow the plan. The next principle or thought is that we're living in condos for specific reasons. So carefree living is not the same as cost-free living. Persons move into condos in part because they're at a stage in their lives where they want others to maintain the facility and the property. While there may be economies of scale when buying services in a multi-unit facility, the cost of living in the condo does increase. And the physical part that you have to put into mowing your lawns or shoveling your sidewalks or whatever decreases. So there is a cost associated with this, and I think the owners have to be reminded of this periodically. Otherwise, they seem to forget it. They want everything on the cheap, but they want everything done for them. The last point and thought or principle is to build credibility. If you want to avoid or minimize problems with owners, the board has to maintain credibility with their finances and their plans. This credibility is built in two areas: the day-to-day operations and when preparing the budget proposal. One requires care and the other requires clear communications. During the normal operating year, the board should demonstrate to owners that they're handling the owner's money responsibly. Multiple quotations, no frills, controlling budgets, reviewing invoices, maximizing cash flow, getting the best interest rates, using tax exemptions. Multiple quotations themselves has saved us over 20% on large projects. We found billing errors that are different from our quotes or contracts. You look at them closely. We found a double billing for services received. We use internet banks for our CDs and get double the interest rates we can get from local banks. Someone has to watch this closely, or else you'll be paying more than you need without even knowing it. In budget pre-preparation, the other time to build credibility is in communicating the budget. We set goals and standards of performance for the maintenance and use this as a guide from planning the budget. Any budget action should then relate to these pre-agreed goals and standards. Develop these goals with your owners. Don't do it by yourself. You can decide what kind of association owners want to be. Robert added 2 slides that illustrate this: Aspen Creek and Ocean Pines. The Aspen Creek slide is an example of too many associations, an example like too many associations just drifting aimlessly downstream towards deterioration. And it shows. The other one, OAP, Ocean Pines, on the other hand, association with specific goals, the example of knowing what your budget is designed to accomplish. So the question is, which would you like to emulate? The budget presentation. The presentation itself is important. I felt if you present a 1-page list of incomes and expenses to owners and ask if there are any questions, your owners stare at you like the deer caught in the headlights at night. While directors and managers are intimately familiar with the budget, owners are not. Owners might not know enough to ask good questions and don't want to look ignorant, so they ratify the budget without a challenge. As directors, if your intention is to confuse, bewilder, or stupefy your owners, this approach would work for you. However, there's a better way. The budget presentation is a critically important communication device. A budget proposal can, first, remind owners and yourself of any constraints or requirements when developing the budget. State your goals, your standards of performance, any policies you decide to follow, any legal requirements that might be constraints. This sets the stage for budget planning. The second part is to communicate the details of the plan clearly enough in words, not in dollars at this point, in words. Just tell them what you're planning to do. Tell them where costs are expected to increase dramatically. Tell them what projects you're working on for the next year. So make sure that the owners agreed fundamentally with what you're planning to do. And then this shows the owners that the board put thought into the budget, into the effort into the budget. It's not just a rehash of last year. There's some real thinking behind it. The proposal document itself, it documents what the board did and why the board did it. And this should be a useful reference in future years. Most budgets shouldn't be a surprise to owners. Your newsletters, meetings, and workshops should set the stage well before the budget is finalized. We use surveys and have budget workshops where we tell owners what we view as the challenges and choices for the next year's budget. Nothing should come as a surprise to owners when they see the final presentation. Build the proposal around words, be descriptive. Owners will understand words more than they understand numbers. After all, a budget is nothing but a dollar reflection of your plan. Don't sell or editorialize, just present the facts in words and let the facts speak for themselves. The budget example, I usually do it in several stages. Number one is a short summary list of what the budget is going to be all about, showing columns for the a budget for last year, the projected budget for this year, the change, and then the budget for this year that's being proposed. You show those columns. And then after that, there's no slide for it, but present a detailed cost for those who want it. Table of all your codes can be presented, a separate column added to this explaining what was done. For example, say no change, a 5% increase, new project, and so on. This makes it easier for owners to follow by light on them. To wrap this principle up, your credibility is enhanced when you spend wisely, control costs, use contracts, pay attention to invoices, maximize your interest income. Your credibility is increased if you use your reserve funds for the intended purpose and not use it as a source of cash to support operations or other projects. So winning basically is when everybody understands the budget, the owners have confidence in the financial management skills of the board, nobody is surprised, and the association has the dollars it needs to operate and meets its short-term and long-term goals. These go a long way to show the owners you're careful with their money. Presenting a clear budget proposal, owners assure clear communications and offset future conflicts and misunderstanding. If you do all this, you'll find that the owners trust you, will understand it, and even if you have to increase fees, they'll understand that part. Thanks for listening.
Well, that's fantastic, Bill. I found myself taking notes here. That's one of the things I enjoy so much about having guest experts on our webinars. Well, it's now time to turn the floor over to Jeff Westendorf. He's a management company owner. Jeff is going to address the skills needed to have budget success, which is basically how you can stack the odds in your favor. Jeff?
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here today. And boy, wouldn't we all love to have Bill as our treasurer? That's,
absolutely.
That would make all of our lives easier. Today, I'd like to talk about the budget process and some things you can do to stack it in your favor. Let's start off with just gathering the resources. You should gather historical budgets. Let's look for trends throughout the year. Let's look at our current year-to-date budget and where we're at right now. Your board should be monitoring the current year-to-date status, and we should know why we're having fluctuations relative to the current year-to-date budget. It's critically important that you get committee recommendations. Believe it or not, July and August is the time period that we start budgeting with our clients. We start by big picture, as Bill has pointed out. What are the goals and the trends? What are the goals of the community? Start those community conversations early. Engage all of your committees. What goals or aspirations do they have? Does the landscape committee want to make changes in how the landscape is done, either by the quantity or the quality of the landscaping that's provided? Same thing with your clubhouse committees. Same thing with your finance committee. Maybe they can be looking at your investment strategy on your reserve fund and come up with a different objective, which might yield a different result. So start early with your committee structure and let those ideas float up to the board of directors. Owner surveys are really critical. I always use these to assess, what do our owners believe about the current status of the goods and services we're delivering to them? Do they believe our current vendors are delivering what they expect? Do they have an expectation for more or for less? I always tell boards all the time, we can deliver as a management company whatever level of service you want. We can find the right vendors. We just need to make sure that we're being honest with everybody and matching the price to that quality and quantity. Make sure you have your vendor and business partner research done. Pull all those bank statements and the information from the past so that you know where you've been at historically. Next, make sure you've looked at your contracts. Do we have long-term contracts in place that might have rate adjustments going forward? Maybe they have inflationary adjustments. We all know that an inflationary environment can cause more price increases on our budget planning for the future. As a manager, we need to make sure we pull those contracts and advise the board. What about that maintenance wish list? I'm in agreement with Bill. We should not be deferring maintenance. However, there probably is a maintenance wish list there that maybe includes some of that deferred maintenance. Let's make sure we put that in the budget on the table for those discussions so we don't miss it. The big item is to look at your projected upcoming reserve projects. And to that, I'm going to talk about that later, but that's making your reserve study document a living document. It's time to pull that off the shelf. It's time to open up that chart where it shows the next 5 years and actually have an honest conversation with our owners. What are we seeing in the next 5 years? Is it roofs? Is it siding? Is it concrete for streets? What are the big projects upcoming? And make sure we're planning to those projects. Make sure you look at your major expense line items in your operating budget. Typically, that's items over 5% of the total budget. Oftentimes, those are large contracts. And again, make sure you have your contracts in place. And then let's talk about making the reserve study a living document. I think this is absolutely critical for buy-in for your reserve study. I think all too many times we tend to have the reserve specialist come out, give us the numbers, the treasurer looks at it, the president looks at it, board looks at it, the manager knows it, but the community doesn't. I'm going to agree with Bill wholeheartedly. Use that as a communication document. Share it with the entire community, but do it in a presentation format where people can understand it. Use words, not numbers. Make it a living document. Pull it off the shelf every year. Remind people of what is in that study in the next 5 years. Remind people of the philosophy, why we replace all of the roofs at the same time, and we don't piecemeal one roof at a time. Remember, we're trying to get the economies of scale aspect of living in a homeowners association. So that living document is absolutely critical. Next, as a manager, one of the most important tools we can bring to our boards, the value we add to the management, is we bring to the board an understanding of our current economic environment. What is the economy like in your community? What is the employment situation like? What is happening to labor prices, inflation, production costs? Explain to your boards that when you're talking about long-term capital projects, it's not tied to consumer inflation. It's instead tied to construction price inflation. And when we're talking about adjusting our operating budget, which Bill has talked about, that oftentimes is tied to the CPI. It could also be tied to gas prices. It could also be tied to other costs that your businesses in the marketplace. So bring that knowledge you have as a manager to bear to the board, because oftentimes boards are volunteers. They don't work in the construction industry. They don't work in the labor market. They aren't out there hiring. So bring that knowledge. What are those construction and labor trends? What are the changes to local wages? We're seeing a lot of changes in minimum wage laws across the country, but more importantly, we're seeing massive escalations in unskilled labor prices. So what effect is that going to have on those contracts? And if you've locked in long-term contracts, there may be consequences to that. Maybe services might be cut, and we need to educate our boards about that. Insurance is always a trend that we need to monitor. Talk to your insurance agent ahead of time before you go into budgeting. What is happening with the premium levels? What has been happening in the marketplace related to claims and investment funds? You know, the bottom line is the insurance companies are going to have to cover claims costs, and if we're in a rising interest rate environment, that's going to affect their premiums. And then interest rate trends. Unfortunately, if you're on the side where you're having to borrow money, those rising interest rates are going to cost you more money. But hopefully, if you're on the side that Bill and I hope you're on, that is, those interest rates are going to add to your reserve funds because you are investing for the future. So what can we do to create some success with the community? Well, I think the first thing is be honest with yourself and all of the owners. You know, I speak that the job of the manager, in my view, is to speak truth to power sometimes. Boards don't always want to hear what we have to say, but failing to tell them the truth about their current financial situation only sets them up for failure in the future. So be honest with yourself and with the owners about the current situation. Next, reinforce those objectives that Bill talked about. Again, I like what Bill says here about using words and not numbers. Reinforce those objectives. Make sure that people know the direction the community is going, and long-term why we're doing what we are doing. If you reinforce those objectives, you'll have greater buy-in from the rest of the community. Next, please give people time to process. One of the things we all start off when we hear a financial piece being emotional. Whenever we get new information that we don't fully understand, we all become emotional. You're raising my dues $50. Immediately I become emotional about that. People need time to review, to analyze, respond, come up with alternatives. Oftentimes as managers and as board members, we've been through that process. We've been living the budget all year long. We've seen the shortfalls, and so we have already gotten over the emotional aspect of the decision-making process. We need to give our owners time to be emotional about that, and then we slowly need to move them to a rational, a logical process. How do we review this in a way that makes sense to them, that can analyze this, and then respond to their concerns? Solicit feedback, create buy-in. And I agree with Bill wholeheartedly. Buy-in is not done in October, November, and December when you're presenting the budget. Buy-in is created all year long by consistently sending a positive message of the good works that the board is doing on the financial aspects of running an association. And finally, you got to keep repeating this process. You've got to keep going back to your owners for many reasons. First of all, our communities are continuously changing. We have new owners buying into our community all the time. Old owners who understood the process have sold, left. We have constantly new owners coming into our community. We need to continually re-educate everybody about the goals of the organization, the budget planning process, the objectives of how our long-range plan ties in, what our operating budget comes in, what level of quantity and quality of services we're going to deliver, so that everybody is continuously on the same page. Next, Robert. Other tools you can utilize: newsletters, board meetings, budget committee meetings, websites, bulletin boards, social events. What I don't want you to do is focus only on one of those. What I would strongly suggest is that you have a team approach to delivering and communicating with your community. This is going to change depending upon the age and the makeup of your community members. Some find newsletters to be effective. Others want Twitter and social media and other means of communication. Websites, of course, can be effective. But it's about building success with the community. It's about building trust. And so sometimes it could be small group living room conversations, just giving people a forum to express views. How about quarterly town hall meetings? Nothing better than some food to bring everybody together and just have an open and honest discussion. It does take a good, strong board leader, though, to facilitate discussions. And I just make a couple points about facilitating discussions when you're building community. That leader needs to lead a discussion that is very open-ended and does not provide a defense to the questions that are posed. It simply is thanking people for their input, acknowledging the input, and not having to respond to every item. You give people the forum to express views and then open it up to dialogue, open it up to encouraging dissent, open it up to expressing new ideas. Oftentimes we can find common ground in the areas of compromise. That's a skill that our country certainly could grow to use more often. Next, today's decisions do affect the future. Good versus bad decisions. I always tell boards, the decisions you make today will establish in the future, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what decisions or opportunities or crises or failures you're going to experience in the future. Think of it this way. Your board today is facing opportunities or crises based upon the decisions that were made 20 years ago. If 20 years ago the board did not do as Bill has suggested, properly fund reserves, then today you are facing special assessments. You are facing borrowing money. You are facing deferred maintenance. You are facing what we call the downward spiral. The downward spiral will ultimately end up with property values that decrease. However, if 20 years ago the board made the tough political decisions to raise the dues and properly fund the reserves, as Bill has indicated, then you will be what we call on the upward spiral. The upward spiral will mean you'll have plenty of money in your reserve fund. You'll be able to select the best products and the best contractors to maintain your property at a high level. You'll have happy owners because you will have attracted owners who understand the proper price to live in your community. And property values will be on the rise because you will continually always be maintaining your property at a high level. Ultimately, everything that we're doing here is going to affect property values. So don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Today is the day to make the tough political decision to move you towards that upward spiral in the future and avoid the downward spiral. What does the downward spiral look like? Well, if we fail to fund our reserves, that's going to lead to large special assessments. Those large special assessments are going to create a financial hardship. Those financial hardships will increase our delinquencies, our foreclosures, and our bankruptcies. When those items go up, that means that there's even more delinquencies, because as unit owners go through foreclosure and bankruptcy, it means we have even less money to perform the tasks we do. And interestingly, when they go through foreclosures and delinquencies and bankruptcy, they don't just harm our long-term budget, they also harm our operating budget, because if somebody's not going to pay their dues, they're not going to pay all of their dues. Those delinquencies will mean less revenue, which means now we have to cut services, we have to go back to the owners back up at the top, and we have to do more special assessments with even a smaller pool of owners. So there are real costs to getting in the negative downward spiral. So you're not really saving your owners money by keeping your dues low. As Bill pointed out earlier, you're going to pay, and you're going to pay for it in the end anyway. What are some of the hard questions? Well, our owners can't afford it, but our owners can't afford it. I'm going to harken back what Bill said. It's not the job of the board to be concerned about the owner's individual personal budgets. If the owners can't afford it, the board needs to set the policy that's best for the community as a whole. If our owners can't afford small monthly increases today in the form of increased dues, then what makes us believe they're going to be able to afford the $5, $10, $15, or $20,000 special assessment that needs to be payable in 90 or 120 days? Simply raise the dues. The owners that cannot afford it will make a smart business decision and sell their home, go to a community that they can afford, and you will attract fellow owners that can afford it, and then this argument's going to disappear. Our assessments are higher than our neighbors' properties. I always tell people, when you're comparing neighboring properties, that's like comparing apples and oranges. Neighboring properties don't have the same declaration that you have. They don't have the same operating costs. They don't have the same economies of scale. They don't have the same number of units. There are so many factors that go into comparing assessments between property to property that it just is not a fair assessment. Instead, I think we need to make the argument be, what is the proper cost for us to live here based upon our goals and objectives? And we all ought to be willing and able to pay for that. If not, then we need to reassess either the goals and objectives or the community, or the individual owner needs to reassess if that is the right community for them. The owners just don't care. Well, if the owners just don't care, I think then the board needs to help the owners to care. Reach out to those owners. Maybe you need more community forums. Maybe you need a way to engage the owners. Maybe you need to go to the owners and engage them to help them to care. There's nothing better than small living room conversations, I've found, to do this. The small group of 10 owners or less, where everybody can get around and you can get them to care by pointing out. The owners will care if they feel like they're empowered to be a part of the solution. The rush to get it done. The rush to get it done. Well, I would say, again, focus on the entire process. Budgeting should not be done in November so that you can get it done by January. But budgeting starts now. Budgeting starts now with community conversations and discussions. It evolves with engagement with your committees, engagement with your community. It then evolves to proposed budgets with the board so that you can have open discussions. Then you send out a sample of that budget, a draft of that budget to the community, and you hold community forums. You then bring the community in and you have open discussions before you vote on it. I want to emphasize here that the best thing a board can do is hold all of these meetings in an open and transparent way. Please don't have your boards be holding workshops in private and meeting in private to discuss budgets. The reality is the community members will know that you met privately, and they will always assume the worst of boards if you're doing that kind of conduct. Be as transparent as you can, be as upfront as you can, and don't push this down their throats at the last minute. And how do we fit in reserve contributions? Well, we fit in the reserve contributions by looking at a reserve study, and we just do it. To be brutally honest, we just do it. It's like Bill explained earlier, it starts with your word choices. There is no doubt you need to budget to pay the electricity bill. It is the bill that needs to be paid. There should also be no doubt or debate that you need to pay for your deterioration on your property. What I like to do, and I agree with Bill here, is change the way we word reserve contributions. You are not paying for the future roof. Instead, what you're paying for is the deterioration of the roof you've lived under today. That roof you've lived under today has a cost. Have the owners calculate that cost themselves and actually break it down on a monthly basis and talk about the roofs, the siding, the windows, the concrete, anything that's the association's responsibility. Get them to see that we're simply asking them to pay for what they used up today. And it's only fair that we pay for what we used up today, and that way you don't burden future owners. So let me take a few moments to summarize what Bill and I have said. Boards do have a legal responsibility they cannot dodge. As managers, we have a responsibility to remind them of that, to nudge them, to cajole them, to do the right thing. It's in their best interest. It's kind of like encouraging your kids to eat a balanced diet. It's in their best interest. They may not like it, but it's in their best interest. So for your community association boards, an adequate sustainable budget should not even be considered an option. The great thing is that your board and every board has the freedom to make choices. A great future is in this for you. Waiting to be grass-fed or created, you just need to make the choices. We're here because we have years of experience and want to share our stories and insights because we believe your association truly can achieve this great future. A peaceful and productive community with maximized home values is the goal. We want your community to thrive. And finally, if we've all talked about today seems like a big change, don't get discouraged. See it as a multi-year journey. Take a step in the right direction this year, then take another step next year. Lay out a multi-year plan for your association when the funds are needed, and give your owners a few years to get comfortable with this new assessment structure. A nice lobby, a new entry gate system, those improvements to your property will make it easier for you to build trust with your community so that next year's increases will be more amenable to them.
Well, thank you, Bill and Jeff. That's just tremendous information. I like hearing it from the experts. I wish we could make this required content for every board across the country. I want to thank everyone here for attending. Hopefully we've helped by providing some ideas for you to take back to your association about what winning this budget game looks like, and left you with some skills so you can improve your chances for a successful outcome. Well, that wraps up our prepared content for today's webinar. But let me take a moment to alert you to some follow-up resources that we have. Here at Association Reserves, our brand is all about helping associations improve their future. So that's why we present webinars like this one. We help our clients with easy to understand reserve studies, and we help all associations with a deep library of written and video resources on our website, which is reservestudy.com. And you can go there and click to request a proposal or sign up for our email list to be notified of future relevant reserve and budget events. And for Jeff at West Property Management, if you have some follow-up questions, or if your association is anywhere close to West Des Moines, please feel free to contact Jeff there at West Property Management. And as a reminder, the first thing that caught our attention about Bill was a series of budget articles he wrote for CAI Connecticut. It's a well-written series, and we've posted that entire series on our website. It's a great read. And if you want to, download it for your management company, your board, or your budget committee. So, on behalf of myself, Bill, and Jeff, and the companies we represent, thank you for attending. We hope we've shared enough to let you know how you can get on and stay on the winning path. That concludes our prepared content. So at this time, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will coordinate our Q&A time together.